NHS, the war in Ukraine, all undoubtedly enormous issues. But there are relatively few on local government, despite the fact that for most people, the way that they interact with the state most of the time is through local government. And so we do this panel every year. The background to it is that council budgets, as we know, are stretched. Central government funding has been reduced over the last 13 years. And at the same time, we've seen increased demand for services. We also know that there is pressure, not least from the Taxpayers Alliance, to not increase council tax. So there is a question of where and how to find the funds. More and more councils are, as a result, experimenting with new ways to raise funds. For example, Gedling Council have set up a pet crematorium. Multiple councils have engaged in commercial investments, most notably Woking and Croydon. And other councils have introduced charges for services that they previously provided for free. In perhaps the most notorious example of recent council experimentation, though, one council, South Cambridgeshire District Council, has brought in a 4-day week in an attempt, at least they say, to address problems of recruitment. So we're here to discuss what role experimentation plays in local government, and I'm delighted to have with me Martin Beckford from the Daily Mail, who's one of the few journalists that take, or few lobby journalists at least, who take an active interest in local government. I also have Councillor Joanne Laban of Enfield Council, Lee Rowley, the local government minister, Andrew Sheldon somewhere.
Just at the end.
There we go. You, who former leader of Castle Point Borough Council and Essex County Councillor, and also Councillor Heather Williams, leader of the opposition at South Cambridgeshire District Council. Martin, I'm going to start with you because one of the underlying trends to all of this is as councils have experimented more, we've seen local scrutiny, particularly in the form of local media, deteriorate. So that's sort of two quite interesting competing trends.
Yes, that's right. And thanks very much for coming this morning. As Elliot said, I'm policy editor of the Daily Mail, and very glad to be here because I do think this is an area that's been overlooked for too long. Certainly, I'm afraid I'm going to take some blame for that in the press. You've probably all seen in recent years there's been an entire literary genre sprung up of what's wrong with Westminster, you know, our broken politics, MPs are so awful and everything. But how many books are there? How many books have there been about all the crises in local councils? I couldn't find a single one. Although, if there's any publishers out there, I think Elliot and I could write one pretty quickly for you. But and this is despite the fact that most of the problems in Parliament, you know, if PMQs is a bit too rowdy or whatever, they don't actually affect people and their finances. By contrast, as we all know, councils deal with, you know, real things, bins, libraries, parks, and as the residents of Croydon can attest, if your council goes bust, it's you that ends up footing the bill. But as I say, I'm here to take some of the blame for the lack of scrutiny of councils, particularly on national papers. I trekked to Bournemouth through the cold and wind and rain to the local government association conference. This was in July, by the way. But I was the only person from Fleet Street there, even though there was 2 cabinet ministers speaking and Lee as well. I mean, part of this is obviously the people involved aren't national figures, and the assumption might be that what's going on in one council won't be of interest to readers in other parts of the country. But if there's one positive consequence of what's been going on in Birmingham and Woking and so on, hopefully it'll be that national papers like mine take more of an interest, and maybe our scrutiny could stop further scandals happening in the future. But of course, the main problem is in local papers, and although there are still some titles doing great work, a select committee recently found that at least 320 local papers had shut down in the years between 2009 and 2019. So that can only have a massive effect on the scrutiny. There's huge areas of the country that aren't being covered properly. And unfortunately, even when there are local papers or websites left, there's no guarantee that they will cover councils properly. The one in my town in Hertfordshire regularly puts on the front page that someone's done a fun run for charity, which is, you know, nice for them and their mums maybe, but it's really no relevance to anyone else. I was a junior reporter on Joanne's patch in Enfield 20 years ago, and we all had to go to council meetings, you know, every single week. I was paid about £12,000 a year at the time, so God knows what my hourly rate worked out at. But we all did it because it was seen as an essential part of the job. Plus, we could claim an evening meal back on expenses, which probably helped as well. But if you think about it, in these areas where there aren't decent local papers now, there will be people, councillors and staff, who know all about the problems in the finances, but are they really going to risk their career leaking a report or whatever to a journalist who they may never have seen at a council meeting and, you know, may just write about fun runs? And just taking the example that Elliot mentioned, the one I've covered most this year in South Cambridgeshire, it was announced last September. When I started looking at it in May, I couldn't find any critical articles about it. I mean, Heather might correct me on that. But
we tried, but it was very difficult. We did press releases, but it was very difficult to get traction, especially when it was in the 3-month period. Like you say, you're up against the machine of the council with a full comms department that just flood it with press releases, and as a small opposition group, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's really interesting. And the other consequence, just to move away from papers, is if the council leaders aren't seeing any criticism, then it's not surprising they're going to think that everything's fine, and they'll just plough on with their projects until it's too late. You know, when I went to a meeting at South Cambridgeshire after the first stories in my paper in the Telegraph, I was expecting there to be a huge row and, you know, calls for it to be abandoned and everything. But in fact, some of the councillors said that I was the problem and that I shouldn't be criticising an unelected council official, which apparently they thought you're not allowed to do. Anyway, so I'll leave the expert analysis to the others on the panel, but I'll just make one slightly self-interested conclusion. If you could all please keep contacting your local papers, keep reading them, and keep buying them as well. Thank you.
Joanne, Martin touched on something there about, or Heather, rather touched on something there about fighting against the, you know, the power of the central administration. And in Enfield, you both are in opposition to a Labour council, but also to a Labour mayor. So, I mean, sort of touching on that, what's your experience?
It can be very difficult, even if you gain seats like we did in Enfield Council at the last election. It's about completely doing lots of press releases and hoping you'll get one in. We have a very good, because of the lack of scrutiny and papers closing in Enfield, a new community newspaper has been created, and it's out once a month, and they managed to get the BBC Local Democracy reporter given to them to have, and he is coming to meetings now in a way they didn't, and that's getting more traction in the paper about what's going on at Enfield Council. The structure of scrutiny is quite difficult as well. We have a leader cabinet model, and if people's heart's not in it, or people don't turn up, then you don't have the quality of the scrutiny. We have cabinet meetings where the public turn up and wish to ask the cabinet questions. Doesn't sound too bad for a taxpayer-funded organisation, but they say it's a meeting held in public, not a public meeting. So therefore you can restrict, and you have to go to the monitoring officer, and if the monitoring officer backs the administration, then you can't even ask a question at the cabinet meeting, where important decisions as expenditure of millions goes through, but you can't ask a question at the cabinet meeting. So it is quite difficult. When it comes to the Mayor of London, it's about councillors liaising with the Conservative group on the London Assembly, where we don't have a Conservative constituency assembly member using the London-wide model to our advantage and using them to hold the Mayor to account. For example, Enfield wants to build on the Greenbelt through its local plan and declassify Greenbelt areas in my ward. And we managed to get Andrew Boff to ask a question of the Mayor and embarrass him into, what are you going to do? Your London plan says you'll protect the Greenbelt, but your Labour Enfield Council wants to declassify huge swathes of it. Which way are you going to do, Mr Mayor? So you can use the Conservative group on the London Assembly to hold the Mayor to account.
Lee, you've obviously made the decision that in the case of South Cambridgeshire District Council, their experimentation is reckless. I mean, how do you view this topic?
Thank you, and huge thanks firstly to the TPA for all the work that they've done on this. It's incredible and vital that this kind of oversight and scrutiny is provided, irrespective of what individual views are on things like the 4-day week, and also to Martin for looking at local councils and making sure that they're held to account for their residents. I believe in local councils. I'm a former local councillor of 8 years standing. I think councils do an incredible job, and they do it in often difficult and challenging circumstances. And so I'm a big advocate of local democracy, a big advocate of innovation. I'm just not an advocate of stupidity. And that's the difference which we're talking about at the moment. We need innovation in local government. When I was a councillor, I finished being a councillor in 2014. There was a series of challenges which needed to be gotten through by my council at the time, Westminster, and in order to do that, we needed to have the space to think through how to get through those processes. We needed to think about how to do things differently. That's absolutely vital that continues, and it's important that we allow councils the space to do that, so that when one finds something which works better, it can be distributed around the system. It's also important because we need them to be ever more effective, ever more efficient, and they're all going to need to look at how to make that happen through automation, through IT, through doing things differently. Things like the Town Fund is deliberately set up to promote innovation. It's giving multiple amount of monies to multiple areas to see how we can get a broad understanding of how regeneration works in towns. And so we're asking individual towns to make a call, and then we see what comes back, and hopefully some of those things will be transferable to elsewhere in the country. So I'm a massive advocate for innovation. And if you go on, we launched something called the Office for Local Government just a few months ago, which is a data repository effectively, which allows you to compare your performance of councils. It's not finished yet. There's a lot more data which needs to go on it. But if you go and have a look at that, there's quite a lot of variability in terms of the unit cost of waste, the delivery of adult social care. And so we want councils to innovate so that they close the gap in terms of cost and in terms of service quality and things like that. So I'm in favour of it. The challenge that we have is twofold. One, a set of councils who have done, a very small set of councils who have done specific individual things and individual decisions which have gotten them into real distress. You've already referenced a couple of them, Croydon, Thurrock, Woking, elsewhere. Every single one of those was a localised decision or lack of decision in some of those instances, or a localised strategy or localised poor decision making. If at the end of it, the government acts as the backstop, they act as the guarantor, quite rightly, where we've had to step in, we've had to send commissioners into some of those, we've had to try and right the problem that they've created, government does have a responsibility to make sure that some councils do not get there quicker because they're adopting approaches which just fundamentally don't work. So the government does have a responsibility in some areas to do this, recognising the sovereign independence of local councils. And then secondly, on the 4-day week, which I'm sure we'll come to in a moment, that the thing which I struggle with, particularly on the 4-day week, if an individual company, an individual private organisation wants to burn its own capital in terms of experimentation and investment, they should be allowed to do that. They should be held to account by their shareholders for it, and if the shareholders are happy with that capital being burnt in a good or a bad way, that's up to them. It's different in the public sector. It's different because there is an expectation of delivery, and there are people at the end of those services who need those services and are often in desperate need of those services. This is not the place to innovate on these things. And I'm afraid what South Cambridgeshire is doing is just bizarre. It's bizarre in terms of the decision that it's made. It's bizarre in terms of the evaluation which is going on around it, which I find extraordinary, some of the assertions that have been made, and then when you go and look at the so-called independent evaluation reports, show very little relationship with the headline that everything's going well. And ultimately, it's bizarre because you're getting into this place where there is a strain of thinking on the progressive left, which is to demand more, to require more, and to do less. that is not something which works. You can't align all those things into one place, and then you end up in these extraordinarily strange places like a 4-day week. So the government respects the independence of local authorities. It wants them to do well. It wants them to innovate and experiment. But also it does have to say sometimes this is not on and you shouldn't be doing it.
Heather, Martin suggested that people might not be interested in what's happening in other councils. Your council might possibly be an exception to that.
I think it is at the moment, definitely. Just picking up on a few things that have been said, innovation completely, and there are things that can be done and have been done. For example, we now get funds about 3 million a year from a rental company, a business that was set up. So if you don't want to, you've got two options in local government. You either cut services, which of course politically no one ever wants to do, or you've got to find new ways of creating revenue. The thing with the 4-day week is it doesn't do either of those. There's no benefit. There is claimed financial benefit, but when I've gone through the figures, they tell you how much they save. They don't tell you how much it costs. You know, the bin crews can only collect so many bins in a day, so you need more bin lorries. By the way, they're electric as well, so you don't get much change out, £500,000 each time you buy one. So you then have more staff on 4 days, but even the health and well-being reasons that have been given, we're told that this is to improve the health and well-being of staff. Yet we know that one of the highest sickness issues we have is musculoskeletal issues in our waste service, and yet they are doing 32 hours, and the office-based staff, or knowledge-based staff as they've been called, I think quite crudely, are doing 30, which includes senior officers such as chief exec and so on. And I just wanted to touch a bit on the power of the administration, because I sit here as a councillor of South Cambridgeshire, and I have never been allowed a vote on whether the council that I am elected by residents to represent has had, I've never had a vote on it. The Cabinet said that's 8 out of 45 councillors took a decision. And I think there is a really important thing as well about taking people with you and actually seeking that mandate. It wasn't in their manifesto, so they have no political mandate to force it through. And yet, something that has affected everybody, 80% of residents have had absolutely no say in that at all, because 80% of councillors have not been allowed to vote. And I think we say about the press, it is incredibly hard for opposition to get that foot in the door. I've had, as you can imagine, quite a bit of attention on South Cams of late, but that is coming from nationally. And I don't mean to criticise the local press, because those that are there, I know, work incredibly hard, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the time. And also I'd say, as councillors, majority of us have full-time or part-time jobs. It's a voluntary role. So that's what worries me so much about, say, the independent or lack of independent report. It's almost as if the whole democratic process, which is meant to be that councillors are lay people, it's a bit like when you have a jury, that they should be your peers. And I think there is a problem for democracy here if we are refused votes, and we've asked a lot to have a vote, but also to be sort of exploited by presented reports. We get 1,000-page agendas. We get so many reports. Which ones have got the truth in, which ones have got a lot of poetic license to. And I think actually across the board, councillors are very vulnerable to that. And I think some people know that and exploit that. It's leaving a very sour taste with residents at the moment. A lot of people, the residents haven't been consulted either, and I think that's something that in one of your letters you touched on, and it's a really important thing. We have an obligation and responsibility to serve residents, not to impose our ideological wills in such a manner.
Andrew.
Hello, good morning, everybody. So just reflecting on I think some of the debates so far, scrutiny is incredibly important. Absolutely. But these days, most scrutiny for my own local council, I used to be leader in Castle Point, my own district council, comes from about 4 or 5 Facebook groups. And that's pretty much it. Even the local paper will just take quotes and take stories from a Facebook group as opposed to calling me or calling other councillors for that. And I think if you were to ask the general public, is experimentation with local government a good idea, as people do on these Facebook groups occasionally when someone comes up with a good or even a harebrained scheme, resounding response is no, unless it's to do with potholes, in which case people are willing to give anything a try, quite frankly. But I think when it comes to experimentation, I think absolutely right. Innovation, fantastic. Experimentation, absolutely not. We're talking about taxpayer money here. I think for it to work, I think you've got to have three things. You've got to have a good, solid leadership. You've got to have ambition, but also you have got to have a really solid culture of accountability and scrutiny. And that means not just about public engagement and the public being able to scrutinise decisions, but also, as we've heard from various other speakers, good council structures to actually allow it, and actually good attitudes from those senior local officers. Normally, if you come up with a good idea, whether you're opposition, whether you're leadership, unless the triumvirate of senior local government officers, unless you're head of paid service, your monitoring officer and your 151 officer, section 151 officer, council's chief accountant are behind it, there's no way on earth it's going to happen. And actually, I think in some cases, there's almost a desire to keep on with the status quo and throw as much under the carpet as possible constantly. I would have loved, while I was leader of the council, to put forward some innovations. I did try, very much so, but I struggled to even get past a public space protection order to deal with boy racers past the legal department. In the end, I had to do a series of written directions and just end up just announcing it in council, saying it was happening, to actually move the monitoring officer's needle on it, which I found absolutely crazy. Really, I did. But innovation, we have to innovate, particularly county councils really do have to innovate. So we've seen massive explosions, of course, in demand for SEND services, adult social care. Again, more people are getting old. The generation of the 60s who perhaps used to experiment a bit more with drugs and with other things, they're getting old now. They're needing adult social care in a way, and simply we are going to have to look forward to innovation. But I think when it comes to this, I'll be perfectly honest with you, if I could pick a solution for it, as was alluded to actually by Heather, because councillors are part-time, because the officers are full-time, and because we seem to have that break between accountability that we used to have, when we did used to have, good solid local reporters like Martin going to local council meetings, sitting down asking questions, as opposed to just picking things off of Facebook to do. I think in order to get that back, quite frankly, we need to look at full-time local government representatives, actually, because then it's going to be incumbent upon them to actually go through to scrutinise fully. You are going to get, I know people don't like full-time politicians, some people say that's a terrible idea. Nope. I think in order to frankly beat the Sir Humphreys in town halls, you're going to need them, quite frankly. So if I could say what the solution would be, that would probably be it. But just in general terms, I think 90% of the time, experimentation in councils is not a good idea. 10% of the time, when you've got that strong leadership, when you've got a good ambition, and when you have got a solid structure of accountability, that's when they're the ones that really should be driving that innovation through experimentation.
Questions, I think, particularly for Joanne and Lee, and it's something that Heather raised. Is this problem of democracy really crucial to everything? So Heather mentioned, for example, that the council haven't voted on the 4-day week, nor was it in an election manifesto at the previous local elections, or in the case of ULEZ with Sadiq Khan. As far as I'm aware, that ULEZ expansion wasn't promised in the 2021 mayoral election. Is that absolutely crucial, Joanne? Maybe you want to start.
I think, yes, you've got to have a mandate to deliver what you've promised the public at an election. If there's an emergency and something goes wrong and you couldn't possibly have planned it, then local government and the structure allows that flexibility. But I don't think that flexibility should be abused. And it's important that people see local democracy at work and the structures working for them as much as working for the council itself. One of the problems we have in Enfield is we've had quite a lot of consultations of late, and very few, when it's come out as no, has that been taken on board. And we have a problem because people feel they're not being listened to. So why should I bother responding to another consultation? And that is bad for Enfield, it's bad for the council, and it's bad for residents, because they should have some trust that when someone goes out to consultation, they will be listened to, because otherwise, what's the point? And I think that's really important. With the ULEZ expansion, it's just the fact he put it in the manifesto to the North and South Circular. He had that mandate. Not that I backed it at all, but nevertheless, he won the election, and that was part of his manifesto. This extension that he's done isn't backed by the people who, in my opinion, are impacted by it in Outer London, and he should have listened to the public and not taken it any further. But he's decided to go forward just in the same way Labour Enfield has had a consultation on bins, had a consultation on low traffic neighbourhoods and things like that, where it's come out as no, it's not the decision that they want, so they go ahead regardless. And I think it loses support from the public. And in the end, the public pay for the local authority.
Lee, is the lack of democracy in the 4-day week a really key thing to you? Or is it just the case that some experiments should never be tried, regardless of whether or not there is, for example, a mandate at the election?
I think my preference is that decisions like this are made at the ballot box, and that is ultimately the place where things should stand or fall. When, in general, when my local Labour council at the time comprehensively, universally, completely screwed up its local plan, we took them apart at the ballot box, and that was the right thing to do. It was to put the problem in front of the electorate, it was to make the case, and then it was to allow the electorate to make a decision. However, the one caveat to that is there has to be guardrails around that. There has to be guardrails for reason one, which you talked about a few minutes ago, which is the government can't pick the pieces up every time a council makes a series of catastrophic decisions. It has to do that, but we can't have lots of councils ending up into that place. And secondly, there are just some things which just are sort of, they don't pass the smell test, they don't pass the sniff test that it's a sensible thing to do, and that's my view on the 4-day week within the public sector, and that's why we are being pretty clear that it's not an appropriate thing to do. My preference is, as I say, the ballot box is the ultimate decision maker here, but there has to be a role for government in saying, you know, these things aren't acceptable. You would not, taking it to its logical extension, its logical conclusion, you would not let a council borrow a whole heap of money and pop down the casino and put it all on black. So, you know, so there is a continuum here of things that are absolutely unacceptable and things which are perfectly acceptable, and then there's this difficult bit in the middle, as with all public policy, and the government tries to respect the independence of local authorities, it tries to allow them the opportunity to innovate, but sometimes it does have to say this is not a sensible thing to do.
Martin, Andrew has mentioned that he found it actually quite difficult to innovate because of the relationship with council officials, whereas we've also touched on how some councillors find it difficult to stop council officials from innovating in such ways. Andrew mentioned possibly the answer to that being more politicians. What would Daily Mail readers?
Full-time politicians.
More full-time politicians, sorry. What would Daily Mail readers, and what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I think, you know, people might assume that councillors do have the time to read all the agendas. I remember, again, with Enfield, the guy who ran my local dry cleaners was an Enfield councillor. I couldn't believe that he had time to work. He used to work, you know, so hard running a shop, but he was also on the council, and it is incredibly difficult to do both jobs very well. So I can certainly see the attraction in having full-time councillors, but possibly not on all levels, because I mean, if you were on a county and a district council, you know, you end up getting paid pretty well for that, and as you know, with often your great reports, we do cover, you know, the town hall rich list and so on. So, but if it meant, you know, much greater scrutiny, I mean, there wouldn't be much point in having paid councillors if, as Joanne and Heather have said, they don't get to vote on anything. You know, what would be the point if they had all the knowledge but they weren't allowed to exercise their vote? So it would have to be pretty looked at pretty closely, I think.
One of the reasons why councils are experimenting is to address problems with recruitment. Heather, that's the reason why South Cambridgeshire have given for their trial. Do you agree that there are these problems of recruitment? and what sort of solutions are there, if not something like a 4-day week?
I think recruitment is a problem. It's been a problem for certain what are dubbed hard to fill spots for some time, particularly actually in planning. You train up a planning officer, they do really well, they're great, and then normally sort of the developer that was dealing with them as a council officer then offers them a far more lucrative job than we can afford. I mean, I think there are other ways to deal with it other than, well, the leader of our council dubbed it a gift to officers. She says it was a gift for a job well done and for working really hard if they could get their work done in 4 days. And I personally don't think that you start gifting a day's annual leave a week. It can get very expensive very quickly. And I know they've mentioned the recruitment. I mean, there are other things that can be done. I think local government sometimes doesn't actually sell itself as an employer of choice. Actually, local government is normally very good for people that have disability requirements. It's normally much more accessible than some private companies. I don't think we use that enough and promote that enough. Actually, you can have flexible working hours, and by that I don't mean spending all your time at home, which is currently at South Cambs. Bear in mind, there is no requirement for an officer to actually physically come into the building either, as we found out the other day. But you can give that. Some people like to do compressed hours. I think that's a very different question. The problem we have here, and I think actually why we struggled to get traction, was people understanding what a 4-day week actually means, because it can mean different things. And I think that's what we were really, at the start of this, really struggling to cut through on. It's not compressed hours. If somebody wants to work longer days, but they're still working the hours that they're paid for, then that can be flexi working. But this is actually 30 hours rather than the 37 they're contracted and paid for. And I think it's that, I know that's been a bit of an issue for people to get their head around. So I think there are lots of incentives, and actually in the current climate, job security in local government is a lot better. We normally see when economic and times are harder, actually our recruitment improves, which is why I have a lot of doubt that these 9 places that they've filled should be held as a raving success, as has been said. So yeah, there are problems, definitely, but I think there's more we could do to sell the opportunities, not to mention the pensions tend to be quite good as well. But, you know, there's lots of things that can be done without bribing people with 52 days extra annual leave a year.
If I can just agree with Heather on that one. I think to say things like that are a gift are utterly ludicrous, quite frankly. I mean, you know, if you're paid to do a certain amount of hours, you should do them. If you manage to do your work well, there's always other work to be done, either in the department or you know, or getting ahead on time to deal with bulge areas. But I think when we look at other areas, I mean, you mentioned planning, and I think, of course, people go into plan. Yes, there is a shortage of planners. I think people normally these days, they go into planning at local government, probably for the pension, as you say, but also for the idea that, you know, you do well, you sit down, you do your time, you get your experience, you form perhaps even a successful local plan, and then Wimpy and Barrack come and pay with a load of money to move into there. But when it comes to areas like social workers, I think there are lots of areas of local government that are callings, right? And social work is actually one of them. You could say teachers and things like the others, but social work very much so I'd say is a calling. And I sat down at the county council and we sat and we worked out, you know, how could we improve retention, how could we improve and get more productivity out of social workers. And we did a time and motion study, and normally I think those things are useless, but on this occasion it showed something rather interesting. There was a massive part of this pie chart of a day of a social worker. It was about 15% of the day, and I said, well, what does this say? This can't be right, surely. This isn't the travel, this is the parking. This is parking here, right, on this thing. And they said, yes, no, absolutely, because, of course, in our areas where our social workers visit more often, there's normally no free parking. And, of course, you know, we although we can pay for parking, you know, we do encourage them to park somewhere for free and just kind of walk to walk to their appointments. And I said, well, why don't we give them parking permits then, so they can park on, you know, double yellow lines, for example? And they said, oh, well, that would be up to the Highways Authority. Sorry, we're the Highways Authority. let's just do it. And it saved a six-figure sum simply on that. Improved working conditions. Social workers absolutely loved it. I think when we've exhausted common sense, then perhaps you might say there's an argument to look for things like that. But I still think there's plenty of time and plenty of things that could be done to improve common sense solutions, say the taxpayer money, improve working conditions that would help with staff retention.
I just want agree. You don't need to do a 4-day week for 5 days pay. And I think it's about fairness with the amount of services we deliver. If you're a council worker who has to be on site 5 days a week, and you know someone above you sitting in the conservatory doing with the laptop up with a big mug of tea, there would be a lot of resentment there, and it needs to be fair. It needs to be fairness across the organisation, and that isn't fair, and it's about respect, because at the end of the day, most taxpayers, the public, would be more put out by some of the people who need to be in 5 days a week to do their role than some that are doing 4 days a week for 5 days pay in South Cambs. And it's important that people see taxpayer value from council staff. Working for a council is good. There is flexibility. Long before COVID, there was flexible working and you could work from home. A lot of people did 1 day a week. We managed to retain parents who have children and they come back, and we could arrange their hours, compress them, go to part-time. We have good, so we can support people, but we don't need to go through the ridiculous thing like South Cam when you're getting 4 days pay for 5 days work. It's just unfair.
One of the interesting things mentioned is how good the pension provision is in the public sector, but this is not something that's actually always accounted for. And one of the recent suggestions for how to improve pay in the NHS is to allow NHS staff to take a small reduction in their pension contributions in order for them to see an improvement in their salary. Lee, is that something that the whole of government should really be considering, instead of as well as local government, so that people can see more of that income when they're younger?
Forgive me, I probably won't go there. But, I mean, it's ultimately for local councils within the boundaries of what the law says and what the guidance is to make decisions about what they want to pay and how they want to pay and how they want to structure their remuneration. And there is a challenge when, as a former councillor, as a current Minister for Local Government, I see things that are done brilliantly every day in local government. I see things that I disagree with. But I have to take, if I believe in devolution and if I believe in the principle that local authorities have the right to make decisions, then I have to take a bit of a self-denying ordinance on most of the things that I disagree with. And I get lots of people writing to me about certain schemes and about certain things that councils do, and we have to send something back saying they're sovereign bodies, it's for them to decide and them to determine. And I think it's this guardrails point that when things are just so beyond the concept of common sense, then government will step in, or when things are happening that are so likely to end in tears, the government will step in. But otherwise, there has to be space for people to make their own decisions, and that includes making bad decisions as well as good decisions.
If I can, to the Minister, I think you're absolutely right. But I think, as perhaps has been illustrated today, I think there is a bit of a problem in terms of the actual levers that councillors can perhaps use to scrutinise and indeed to object to and even discipline, I'd say, senior officers. Don't get me wrong, I said the vast majority of senior officers working for councils around the country, I think, are quite frankly, do it for the right reasons. I think they understand the importance of democracy, but I think in areas where perhaps there's not a strong culture of accountability, even a strong legacy, I think it's actually incredibly hard for councillors to feel like they can actually insert that common sense and pull those levers. So if, for example, you want to sack the chief executive, let's say, you want to discipline the chief executive, the monitoring officer, the first thing they're going to do is turn around and say, that's incredibly hard, and here's what the legal cost is going to be. Even if they've done something incredibly wrong, to do that, here's a report saying, actually, no, they could sue us for this, that, and the other. It's not a right idea. And if that's given to councillors, then they're going to start to second guess, particularly if the monitoring officer, who you don't know their relationship with the chief executive, if they turn around and say, no, I would recommend against it because of the legal implications, or indeed vice versa, perhaps it's the chief executive doing the same, to the monitoring officer, then if you're a councillor sitting there part-time, who perhaps isn't as involved as perhaps they should be in a circumstance, you're going to look at that report and think, oh, well, that's a silly idea. So do we think, is there anything that perhaps the government could do to improve the actual levers of accountability that councillors can pull beyond just, well, I suppose beyond what we've got at the minute? I agree the ballot box should be sovereign, but at the minute it's not, because you've got senior officers perhaps who are also sharing that sovereignty, who are incredibly hard to move and discipline.
I'm always up for discussions about how we better structure local government, and if there's specific ideas, I'm very happy to hear them. I mean, I must say, one, because it's true, and two, because it's important to do so, that there's a substantial amount of fantastic work that goes on across offices, and I don't want to, I know that's not your suggestion in any way, but they work extremely hard, and councils do, most councils do great.
Some of them even do 5 days a week.
Indeed, and hopefully more will do soon as well. But I think my observation on your question would be, I've both served on a council and been close to other councils around the country, and you are right, there are cultural challenges in terms of the interactions between officers and councillors sometimes, between personalities. You always get those in workplaces. I've seen councils where councillors can drive agendas and can make sure that the officer group responds to those agendas. So it's possible to do. I'm not saying it's not hard, particularly if you go into a council where there's not that deep culture of that, but it's possible to move councils into a place where the democratic sequencing is that councillors make the decisions and officers advise and implement, as opposed to something else.
Absolutely. Can I say, I make that comment. I'm quite lucky, I think, looking at this panel. I've been leader of a district authority where I've had those challenges, and I also sit on a county council that I have to say it works really, really well. We've got a strong leadership, strong accountability, and we've got excellent senior officers who truly understand, where their boundaries are. But I agree. I think the problem is, it's just because councils are so idiosyncratic in terms of their culture. I think that's probably one of the key problems. Unless we can give more levers to make sure that culture can be a bit more accountable across the board, I think we're going to run into problems, keep running into problems, and keep getting silliness-like proposals for 4-day weeks.
Final one from me. Heather, one of the interesting things that South Cambridgeshire does, and it's not unique in this, is it shares a lot of services with neighbouring councils. I particularly know this because they share an FOI team, which I interact with.
I think you've used it quite a bit.
Periodically, once or twice certainly. It's possible Martin has as well. How cognizant do we need to be when local councils are experimenting, and the impact that could have on neighbouring councils if things go wrong? So particularly the 4-day week, there are issues to do with sharing. I think is it the waste service with Cambridge City Council? I mean, how important is it?
I think the shared service, look, that is one of the things where actually, when you're looking outside the box at ideas, something that we've done that does work financially, and it's a positive thing. There was a big controversy, so we say, with the 4-day week, in that we share a waste service and, like I say, services with Cambridge City and some with Huntingdon as well. Now, we found out literally like hours before it went live as councillors of South Cambs. The others did not. And I think it was reworded in the independent report, which I do use with heavy inverted commas there, that they weren't consulted at all, and quite rightly they were angry about it. So shared services from a financial point of view are very important, because there's no point having 2 bin lorries literally come up to meet each other at a border, because South Cambridgeshire is unusual, and it's sort of it's a ring donut, if you like, so it goes all the way around the city. So it was common sense to merge those things, and we have a joint local plan coming up, so why would you have 2 sets of officers on one local plan? But I do think there is an issue around the governance, and that perhaps is something that needs to be looked at as more do it. If I could just touch on what was said earlier about sort of home working, there is a real problem with this, though, for isolation and loneliness, which we've raised. We have staff that are now becoming more unwell through loneliness, and they're told they can come into an office. Well, I walked round the office and there were 6 people in that day, so I would maintain that you're just going to be lonely somewhere else. But equally, we know actually on the retention, rather than recruitment, but retention, career progression is a really difficult thing for us to satisfy in local government. And actually, I think those of us that have worked in the private sector will know that it's those conversations when you're grabbing a coffee and those things that actually help to encourage staff and bring them along. So that's not something that a 4-day week is ever going to help. And with the home working, it's great if you've got a house and you've got a spare room, or you've got an office. During COVID, people had to work at home, but we had officers that were working off of ironing boards. Because they're in a studio flat, it could be their first job. You can't just assume everybody's got that space. And with officers, completely, I have my own frustrations with 1 or 2, and you could probably guess who at the moment. But also, politicians, I think, are too quick and easy. It's too quick and easy for them to hide behind officers. Ultimately, the politicians are accountable. And I think, for me, I cannot abide that. If you made that decision, in this case, Cabinet and in Lib Dems made that decision, they should stand behind it. When there are negative press releases or negative responses, it's always a council spokesperson. You never see a Lib Dem Cabinet member attached. And I think that's something that really angers me, because it's hiding from the public, and they'll try and paint us who are opposing it as the nasty people. We get such emotional blackmail, I would call it. It gets really quite tense at times in some of these meetings. I think a lot of that is because something goes wrong, people want to go hide, but if they do that, they're in the wrong job. Politics, one of my colleagues described it as a bit like a football team. You support your team, whether they're top of the league or facing relegation. You've got to stand by what you've done, and I don't think we see enough of that.
Before we open it to questions, Joanne, I believe you wanted to come in.
I just want to agree with Heather on home working. When I was briefed on what life was going to be as we were coming out of COVID and how the council was going to work, it was, we're going to go to home working. And I said, well, we have 16-year-old apprentices. They could be sharing a room with their sibling at home. And I was looked at as if I was mad. I said, not everyone has a large home. No, not everyone has a space to work. And when I said about the sharing the room, it was as if I was mad. But actually, that's not uncommon in a household when you're 16. No, not everyone moves out or can afford to. And with home working, the Labour Council spent millions doing up the Civic Centre. I walk round there and it's a ghost town, even on Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday. We have a breakout area, but there aren't many people to break out with. And there's a table football game thing in the breakout area. But nevertheless, people, if they're not in some of the time, how do they know the grass is overgrown? How do they know the fly tipping's going up? People need to see it on the street. They need to be in the borough to see it. Now, you can do 2 and 3, but the majority should be in the office seeing the local authority that they are working for.
I'm going to open it up to any questions. Gentleman at the back was first up, so please give your name and your...
Yes, my name's Graham Jones. I'm a Southport Conservative Association member, former borough councillor at West Lancs. Can I just say this is one of the most illuminating meetings I've been to for a long time. I'm a great fan of the TPA. John O'Connell came to see us in Southport, and it was wonderful. I've just sent my pledge in, you'll be pleased to know. Well, not pledge, but the email to the borough, to the leader. So well done, TPA, 100%. 20 out of 10, okay?
Thank you very much.
I think we have terrible planning issues where I am in West Lancs. It's awful, right? Absolutely awful. And I'm sorry, Minister, but you're going to have to get this sorted. I hear what Andrew said about full-time councillors. That might be one way of sorting it out, because the current crop we have got no idea. They are having rings. They are being run ragged. They can do what they like, these officers. Nothing gets done. We are having unfettered development where we are at the moment because of this. Houses being demolished because of the new procedures brought in. Planning consents which should never be given. I'm sorry to make a speech here, but I really think the Minister has got to get a grip on this. We can't just leave this to the ballot box. At the moment, we're being punished because of what's happening in Westminster, because of Partygate and things like that. The Minister needs to get a grip of this ASAP, and we bring in some other measures. And by the way, I completely agree with Martin. There is no scrutiny anymore of council meetings. All the local papers have gone. It's a shambles, this. And as for our own borough council, it's like the Marie Celeste. There's nobody there. They're all working from home. I think it's like Tom Scholar, who was working in Argentina.
Okay.
So there we are. That's my point.
Well, thank you. Lee, I think that may have been directed at you.
Well,
if anyone else wants to come in.
I understand your sentiments. I mean, my local, as a constituency MP in Derbyshire, my local council spent 16 years failing to put a local plan in place. We have 1,000 more houses being built at the end of the streets which shouldn't be there. We have more pressure on infrastructure which shouldn't be allowed. And you know, I've lived that and I've seen it. We had very poor enforcement but the difficulty is that I have to have thresholds. They have to be necessarily very high. Otherwise, we don't have local government, and that's the fundamental problem. And so there is a whole heap of things which I have to say I don't agree with, or on a constituency level, if it impacts my constituents, I will fight very hard against, as I know local MPs will do, working with councillors. But we have to allow those processes to continue. It's when they just go beyond the margins of common sense, of which I think the 4-day week is one, where we will seek to step in and we will seek to make clear that the government has a view on it. I have huge sympathy, but ultimately the decisions about local areas should be made by local people as much as possible.
We'll take a trio of questions from these three on the side. Woman at the back, and then
Hi there, Chris Howell here from Cambridge City. I know that Heather's doing a great job holding South Cambs to account over this. It is a complete scandal what's going on with the 4-day week trial. But we've talked a lot about democracy and accountability. Surely one of the problems here in Cambridgeshire is that the local government structure is just so complex that nobody has any idea who does what and who's responsible for what. We've got South Cambs District Council, we've got the County Council, we've got the Combined Authority and the Mayor, all of which are on different political control. We've also got the Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership, which is a sort of cross between a local authority and a quango, which has no accountability as well and is busy squandering cash on failed schemes like congestion charging. Is not the answer here to have a bit of a reorganisation of local government in Cambridgeshire and try and have unitary authorities that give that clear line of accountability and responsibility, and also deal with some of the issues around accountability of shared services?
Sure. And then the lady behind.
My question is, I think this councillor, Heather Williams, I was a little bit shocked when you said that there was a major vote on something strategic, a very important strategic policy, and 80% of the people weren't represented because their councillors were not aware or included in the vote. Having worked in different areas and companies, at strategic level, there are minimum levels set as to how can we move forward without having a quorum or a defined number of people involved in voting at that level. Why do we not have that at local council level? So, like, you know, something major, we need a minimum of X councillors present to vote, or their vote to be considered. I just found it shocking.
And then finally, Sam at the front.
Thank you. I should declare I'm at conference for work, but with another hat on, I'm an opposition councillor in Bromley, so I'm actually a Liberal Democrat. Don't take me down. So I wanted to have a word about South Cambs. As I understand it, the pilot scheme is being audited by Cambridge University. It's making, as sort of others have alluded to, is making already significant savings on planning officer agency spend. I think 200,000 already saved. So, I mean, I wanted to flag that up. I think we're talking about innovation in local government. As I understand it, it's a very expensive part of the world to live in South Cambs. So, I mean, if you are in reality competing with the private sector, and this is obviously one lever that you can pull. And you know, we're out asking councils to innovate. They're trying this. It will finish, as I understand, in March. next year, the pilot scheme. And I think there is a bit of a concern that they're being singled out as perhaps they're a marginal sort of target seat in South Cam's constituency itself. But I think the council has every right to innovate, and as I understand it, the officer front desk of the council is still being maintained 5 days a week and longer hours. And I know the bin collection that Elliot touched on is an incredibly difficult issue around bank holidays. So actually moving that to 4 days might be making it a simpler service to roll out.
I think they were all broadly directed at Heather, but I mean, Andrew, I might just go to you first on the question of, a gentleman mentioned reorganising into unitary authorities. What are your view on unitary authorities, somebody who's done both district and county in the two-tier system?
Personally, I think there are just too many layers. I mean, you know, parish councils, borough councils, county councils. How many times, for those of you who've sat on a council, you know, have you've been asked about something which is actually someone else's council to deal with, and the passing residents don't care about that. They just want someone in power and authority who can deal with it. If it's going to save money, and if it's going to make it simpler, absolutely. I also think, actually, if you've got less layers, it means that you're probably more likely to get more professional politicians and scrutineers who are going to have the time to do it. If you give them pensions, of course. I'd put that in there as well.
Heather.
Right, I'm going to try and take these in turn.
Do you want me to go back through them, or have you...
I've made a little note.
Okay.
If I steer off course, then please do feel free to put me back on it. In relation to layers of government, what we also didn't have mentioned in there is I think we have 7 layers of government in South Cambridgeshire, because we have parish and town, district, county, Greater Cambridge Partnership, combined authority. We have a separate police and crime commissioner, and then we have our MPs as well. So yes, we are, I believe the term is government rich. It gets used. It's like Cambridge is sort of a nice experiment for everything. They experiment, and we have the first of things. We were the only, I think, combined authority area to still have a 2-tier system underneath it. So I think it's probably not for me to come up with that sort of policy right here and now. We'd have to go through groups, and obviously government would be a big part of that, because we've already had devolution, of course. But I do think there are some quick wins. I think the GCP is not actually producing what it was set out to do. It was a good idea in principle, but it's not working. So there would be some layers that could be very easily removed and perhaps merged into other responsibilities, as we now have the combined authority, which we didn't have when the city deal was done. In relation to the vote, this is a big issue, and the problem we have with this 4-day week is it's completely new. So there's no precedent. Constitutions in councils are normally very clear. These decisions can be made by cabinet, which is 8 councillors. These decisions are made by full council. Some are made by sort of audit. You've got all these panels. The 4-day week is completely new. So it's not within the Constitution. It's not something that you would see. And there's this sort of legal argument, is it operational or is it political? Now, I would say it's a political decision, but there is an argument that it's operational. And if it's operational, then it has to go through cabinet and not full council. But just because it is, and it's okay legally to do it, you know, Cambridge City had a vote by their full council. It is a political decision that's been made by the Lib Dem administration to not open it up. So I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if I'm not saying that they've broken any laws, but it is unethical in my view. We mentioned, I'll come on to yours now. Are you ready? So it's been claimed that £550,000 has been saved on agency costs for 9 people joining the council. However, the reports and the scrutiny reports are quite clear that there is no reliable way to say whether that is because of the 4-day week or not. What we also know is at the moment other councils are seeing increased applications and more people coming to you because of the financial situation, and it's a more secure place of work. And the papers are very clear. But what we do know is we need a minimum of 2 extra crews on the bin lorries to take them going. And those bin lorries are £400,000 plus each. So at that point, we're already at a cost, not a saving, I'm afraid. So I think there was some more you said about the savings and things, but as an accountant, I'm afraid the maths don't add up. If they want to do this, they have to accept that it's a cost, not to mention every hour that people are not working is a cost to the taxpayer because they are being paid for that time. And residents, if they're paying for 5 days a week, deserve 5 days a week. And I've had this big debate, and actually a lot of it comes down to, I've been told, but we're paid to do a job. I was like, yes, but your contracts are hourly rated or salary driven. If officers want to do this and they want to keep it and they want to go to performance related pay, well, then that's different. Their contract would reflect that. And actually, that is something that we would really be able to keep that incentive up if it was performance-related pay. But the reality, it's not. It's salaried, and it will just continue. So I'm afraid I don't agree with the cost savings. So the contact centre, they have a rota, yeah, again, but some are at home, some are in. So yes, but we are obviously seeing issues with call times. And what I'd say is, for me, the issue that we have in the call centre is actually they sort of get the blame and money, another £5,000 spent on a mystery shopper exercise to check that our call centre was coping and that they were polite and everything else. But the issue is there's no backroom staff to pass them on to. It's all well and good having the front face of the council open for those hours, but if you've got nobody to refer people to, then actually I was in the council and people, they are genuinely angry. You cannot underestimate the anger that is with residents about this, because at a time when they're working extra, longer hours, taking on second jobs, this is what's happening.
Thank you very much. And I've been given the signal to end as we have already overrun, but I just want to firstly thank everybody for coming. Could I just get a round of applause for our brilliant panel? I think we've set the world to rights, and please do stay for further events in the think tank. Cheers.